What would you do if finding a job meant selling your soul to the devil? Tonight's story follows Carlos Rivera, a 34-year-old father who moved his family to a new country for a better life, only to discover that some opportunities come with a price too terrible to pay. When desperate times call for desperate measures, Carlos found himself face to face with demons that wanted more than just his labor. They wanted his eternal damnation. But sometimes, when darkness seems unstoppable, a mysterious figure appears with exactly what you need to fight back. This is Carlos's story, and it will make you question everything you think you know about faith, family, and the lengths we'll go to protect those we love. Carlos Rivera stood in the customs line at LaGuardia Airport, watching his wife Ana clutch their immigration papers with trembling hands. Behind them, their two children, Sofia, 12, and Miguel, 8, pressed close together, wide-eyed at the chaos of one of the world's busiest airports. "Papa, when will we see our new house?" Miguel asked in Spanish, tugging at Carlos's jacket. Carlos forced a smile, switching to English for practice. "Soon, mijo. Very soon." The truth was, Carlos didn't know much about their new life either. 3 months ago, Ana had received an incredible job offer from a pharmaceutical company in New York, a position that would triple her salary from their life in Mexico City. The opportunity was too good to pass up, even though it meant Carlos would have to leave his successful automotive repair shop behind and start over completely. Next, the customs officer called, and Carlos guided his family forward, their 3 worn suitcases representing everything they own. Their first month in Queens was a harsh awakening. The small apartment they could afford was nothing like the spacious home they'd left behind. The walls were thin, the heating unreliable, and the neighbors seemed to speak a dozen different languages, none of which Carlos understood well. Most challenging was watching his children struggle. Sofia, who had been popular and confident in Mexico City, now sat quietly during dinner, picking at her food. "The kids at school, they make fun of my English," she admitted one evening, her voice barely a whisper. Miguel, usually energetic and talkative, had become withdrawn. His new teacher had recommended extra tutoring, which meant more expenses they couldn't afford. Carlos watched Ana leave for work each morning in her professional clothes, carrying herself with the same dignity she always had. But he could see the stress in her eyes when she came home to find him, still in the same clothes he'd worn all day, still unemployed despite sending dozens of applications. Their savings were disappearing quickly. The initial moving costs had been higher than expected, and everything in New York seemed to cost twice what they were used to. Carlos found himself calculating and recalculating their budget, watching the numbers get tighter each week. "Maybe I should look for a second job," Ana suggested one evening as they paid their monthly bills. "No," Carlos said firmly. "You're already working 10-hour days. This is my problem to solve." But solving it was proving more difficult than he'd imagined. His automotive experience didn't translate directly to American certifications and regulations. His English, while functional, wasn't quite professional level. And everywhere he applied, he was competing with people who had local experience, local connections, local everything. 3 weeks into his job search, Carlos was sitting in a small cafe near their apartment, laptop open to yet another job board, when a man at the next table leaned over. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent Carlos couldn't place. "I couldn't help but notice you're looking for work." Carlos looked up to find a thin man in his 50s, with prematurely gray hair and clothes that looked expensive, but somehow dated. There was something about his eyes. They seemed to look right through Carlos in a way that made him uncomfortable. "Yes, I am," Carlos replied cautiously. "I'm Victor. the man said, extending his hand. "I might have something that could interest you." Carlos shook the offered hand, noting how cold Victor's skin felt despite the warm cafe. "What kind of work?" "Property maintenance, some cleaning, basic repairs. It's at a private residence, older building that needs constant attention. The pay is generous." Carlos's interest was immediately piqued. How generous? Victor named a figure that was almost double what Carlos had been hoping to find for entry-level work. It seemed too good to be true. "When can I start?" Carlos asked, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "Tomorrow evening. The work is mostly nights. The residents prefer not to be disturbed during the day." Victor pulled out a business card with just an address and phone number. "Meet me there at 8 p.m. Bring work clothes and an open mind." Something about that last phrase bothered Carlos, but the money was too tempting to question. The address led Carlos to a narrow street in an older part of Queens he'd never explored. The house stood out immediately, while the neighboring buildings showed signs of renovation and modernization. This one seemed frozen in time. The brick facade was dark with age, the windows were covered with heavy curtains, and the front steps sagged slightly under decades of wear. Victor answered the door before Carlos could knock, as if he'd been watching from the window. "Welcome," Victor said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Come in. Let me show you around." The interior was even more unsettling than the exterior. The hallways were lined with dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb the light from the few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The air smelled of something Carlos couldn't identify. Not quite incense, not quite decay, but something organic and old. "The house has been in the same family for generations," Victor explained as they walked through the ground floor. "We maintain it in the traditional style." They passed what looked like a formal dining room, where Carlos caught a glimpse of several people sitting around a large table, but they were perfectly still and silent in a way that made his skin crawl. When he looked back, the room appeared empty. "Did you see?" Carlos started. "The residents keep unusual hours," Victor interrupted smoothly. "You'll encounter them occasionally, but they prefer not to be disturbed. Your job is to maintain the building, not to socialize." Victor showed him to a supply closet filled with cleaning materials, basic tools, and maintenance equipment. The tasks seemed straightforward enough: replace burnout bulbs, fix leaky faucets, sweep and mop the floors, tend to the furnace in the basement. "Simple work," Victor said, "but it must be done with care and respect. This house has specific needs." Carlos nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. His first few nights at the house were uneventful, if strange. The building seemed to have its own personality. Floors would creak when no one was walking on them. Doors would swing closed on their own, and the temperature would fluctuate dramatically from room to room. Carlos wrote it off as the quirks of an old building with poor insulation and settling foundations. But the other workers bothered him more than the house itself. There were 4 others that he'd encountered, 2 men and 2 women all around his age, all with the same pale complexion and distant expression. They moved through their tasks methodically, never speaking unless directly addressed, and their responses were always brief and monotone. "How long have you worked here?" Carlos asked a woman named Patricia as they passed each other in the hallway. "Time moves differently here," she replied without looking at him, continuing toward whatever task awaited her. Carlos tried to engage the others in conversation over the following nights, but received similarly cryptic responses. They acted less like employees and more like... he couldn't put his finger on it. Prisoners? Sleepwalkers? The work itself was getting stranger, too. Victor would leave him lists of tasks that seemed designed more for ceremony than maintenance. Polish the mirrors in the basement, until they reflect perfectly. Arrange the candles in the front room according to the diagram provided. Replace the salt lines around the windows. Ensure no gaps. Salt lines around windows? Carlos had never heard of such a thing in building maintenance, but the pay was keeping his family afloat, so he followed instructions without question. It was during his second week that he first noticed the sounds. Carlos was replacing a light fixture in the second-floor hallway when he heard what sounded like chanting coming from below. The voices were low and rhythmic, speaking in a language he'd never heard before. When he crept to the top of the stairs to listen more carefully, the sound stopped abruptly. "Is everything all right up there?" Victor's voice called from the ground floor, though Carlos hadn't heard him approaching. "Yes, just working on the lights," Carlos replied, his heart racing for reasons he couldn't explain. The chanting became a regular occurrence. It happened at different times each night, always from different parts of the house, and it always stopped the moment Carlos tried to get closer. He began to notice that the other workers would disappear during these periods, and when they returned, they seemed even more distant and hollow than before. 3 weeks into his employment, Carlos made the mistake of checking the basement during one of these chanting sessions. The basement had always been off limits except for furnace maintenance, but curiosity finally overcame his caution. He descended the wooden stairs as quietly as possible, following the sound of multiple voices speaking in unison. What he saw at the bottom of the stairs made his blood freeze. The basement had been transformed into something that belonged in a nightmare, not a residential building. The concrete walls were painted with symbols that seemed to move in the flickering candlelight, designs that hurt Carlos's eyes to look at directly. The air was thick with smoke that made him dizzy and nauseous. In the center of the room, Victor stood behind an altar made of black stone, wearing robes that made his already pale skin look corpse-like. The 4 other workers knelt in a circle around him, but they weren't the people Carlos had been working alongside. Their eyes were completely black, their skin was ashen. And when they spoke in unison, their voices carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. Victor was holding something in his hands, something that writhed and pulsed with its own dark light. As Carlos watched in horror, he realized it was feeding on the energy from the kneeling figures, drawing something vital from them with each word of the chant. Carlos tried to back away silently, but the old wooden stairs betrayed him with a sharp creak. Victor's head snapped up, and when their eyes met, Carlos saw that his employer's face had changed. The features were the same, but the expression was alien, predatory, and ancient. "Carlos," Victor said, and his voice now carried the same unnatural resonance as the others. "We've been waiting for you to join us." The kneeling figures turned to face him in perfect synchronization, their black eyes reflecting the candlelight like obsidian mirrors. "You see," Victor continued, approaching the foot of the stairs, "the work we do here requires commitment, complete commitment." Carlos's legs felt like they were made of lead, but he forced himself to move backward up the stairs. The others understood. Victor gestured toward the kneeling figures. "They came to us desperate, just like you. In need of money, of purpose, of belonging. We gave them everything they asked for." "What did you do to them?" Carlos managed to whisper. Victor smiled, and Carlos saw that his teeth had become pointed. "We freed them from the burden of their souls. They're much happier now. No more worries, no more pain, no more difficult choices. Just service." Carlos reached the top of the basement stairs and stumbled into the main hallway, but Victor's voice followed him. "You can't leave, Carlos. You've seen too much, learned too much. But don't worry, we'll take good care of your family while you adjust to your new role." The threat to Ana and his children snapped Carlos out of his paralyzed fear. He ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut. Every exit he tried was blocked by some invisible force. "There's no point in struggling," Victor said, having appeared at the end of the hallway without walking there. "You belong to us now. The contract was signed the moment you accepted our offer." Carlos felt something cold wrapping around his ankles. And when he looked down, he saw shadows moving like living things, trying to drag him back toward the basement. But then, something inside him rebelled. These things, whatever they were, had threatened his family, his children who were already struggling to adapt to a new country, who needed their father to be strong and present and human. "No," Carlos said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. The words seemed to have physical force. The shadows recoiled, and Victor actually stepped backward. "You will serve," Victor hissed, his human disguise slipping further. "One way or another." Carlos closed his eyes and thought of Sofia's laugh, of Miguel's bedtime stories, of Anna's hand in his as they'd walked off the plane into their new life. When he opened his eyes, the front door was unlocked. He ran into the night, not stopping until he was 6 blocks away and collapsing against a bus stop bench, gasping for air and trying to convince himself that what he'd seen was real. Carlos spent the next 2 days in a state of constant anxiety. He told Anna he'd quit the job due to unsafe working conditions, which wasn't technically a lie, but he couldn't bring himself to explain what he'd actually witnessed. How could he tell his wife that he'd been working for demons without sounding like he'd had a complete mental breakdown? But Victor's threat haunted him. "We'll take good care of your family." Carlos found himself checking on Sofia and Miguel obsessively, walking them to and from school, inspecting their apartment building for anything unusual. On the 3rd night, Carlos was walking home from another unsuccessful day of job hunting when he realized he was being followed. Not by footsteps, he heard no footsteps, but there was a presence behind him, patient and malevolent, keeping pace with his increasingly frantic walking. When he turned around, the street appeared empty, but the feeling persisted. Carlos ducked into a 24-hour laundromat and pretended to examine the vending machines while watching the street through the window. After 20 minutes, when nothing obviously threatening appeared, he ventured back outside. That's when he saw the man standing under the streetlight. The figure was tall and distinguished, wearing an elegant dark overcoat and a wide-brimmed fedora that cast his face into shadow. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, as if he'd been waiting there for hours. Carlos's first instinct was to run. After his experience with Victor, any stranger felt like a potential threat. But something about this man's posture, his stillness, suggested not menace, but patience, wisdom. "You're troubled," the man said as Carlos approached cautiously. His voice was warm and deep, with an accent that suggested education and travel, but no specific origin. Yes, Carlos admitted, stopping several feet away. "How did you know?" "It's written in how you carry yourself, how you look over your shoulder, how you protect your family." The man stepped slightly into the light, revealing the bottom half of a kind face with a gray beard. His eyes remained hidden in the shadow of his hat. "You've encountered something that challenges your understanding of the world." Carlos felt an unexpected urge to confide in this stranger. There was something about his presence that felt safe, like sitting with a wise grandfather. "I don't know if you'd believe me," Carlos said. "I've lived long enough to know that the unbelievable is often simply the misunderstood. Tell me." So Carlos told him everything. About the job, the house, Victor, the basement ceremony, the threats to his family. As he spoke, the man listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if none of this surprised him. When Carlos finished, the man was quiet for a long moment. "You were right to run," he finally said. "And you're right to be concerned. These entities, they don't make idle threats." "Entities?" Carlos asked. "Very old, very patient, very hungry. They feed on human despair, human surrender. They set traps for people like you, good people facing impossible circumstances. People who would do anything for their families." Carlos felt his heart sink. "So there's nothing I can do? I can't fight them. Can't you?" The man reached into his coat and withdrew something wrapped in simple brown paper. "You fought them already. You said no. You chose your family over their offer. That took more strength than you realize." He held out the package to Carlos. "But saying no was just the beginning. Now you need to mean it." Carlos unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a shirt, simple, white, made of some kind of linen or cotton that felt impossibly soft and seemed to hold its own warmth. "What is this?" Carlos asked. "Protection. Reminder. Armor, if you will. When you put this on, remember who you are and what you stand for. Remember that love is stronger than fear, that faith is more powerful than despair, that a father's dedication to his children can overcome ancient evil." Carlos held the shirt up to the streetlight. It looked completely ordinary, but it felt significant, like it carried weight beyond its physical properties. "I don't understand," Carlos said. "How will a shirt protect my family from demons?" "The shirt is just fabric," the man replied. "The protection comes from what you believe, what you choose, what you're willing to fight for. But sometimes we need something tangible to remind us of our own strength." Carlos looked up to ask more questions, but the man was already walking away, his figure becoming indistinct in the darkness beyond the streetlight. "Wait," Carlos called. "Who are you?" The man paused but didn't turn around. "I'm someone who believes in second chances, in the power of good people to overcome impossible odds. And I believe in you, Carlos Rivera." Then he was gone, leaving Carlos standing alone under the streetlight with a shirt that might or might not be magical, and a decision to make about whether he was brave enough to use it. Carlos spent the rest of the night staring at the shirt and thinking about everything the stranger had told him. By dawn, he'd made his decision. He couldn't live in fear. He couldn't spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, wondering when Victor and his demons would make good on their threat. And he certainly couldn't risk his family's safety by hoping the entities would simply lose interest and move on. The next evening, Carlos put on the white shirt. It fit perfectly, though he was certain he'd never told the stranger his size. As he buttoned it, he felt something he hadn't experienced since losing his job. Confidence, certainty, purpose. "Where are you going?" Ana asked as he headed for the door. Carlos kissed her forehead, then knelt to embrace Sofia and Miguel. "I have to take care of something. I'll be back soon." "Papa, you look different," Sofia observed. "Stronger." Carlos smiled. "I feel stronger." The house looked even more forbidding in the evening light, but Carlos walked up the front steps without hesitation. The door opened before he could knock, revealing Victor in his human disguise. "Carlos," Victor said with obvious surprise, "you came back." "I came to finish this," Carlos replied. Victor's eyes narrowed as he took in Carlos's appearance. "What are you wearing?" "A reminder," Carlos said, pushing past Victor into the hallway. The house felt different now that Carlos knew what it really was. The darkness seemed less oppressive, the cold less penetrating. The strange smells that had made him nauseous before now just smelled like smoke and fear, unpleasant but not overwhelming. "You can't fight us," Victor said, following Carlos toward the basement stairs. You're just one man, and we are legion. Maybe, Carlos agreed, but I'm one man who knows what he's fighting for. The basement ceremony was in full swing when Carlos descended the stairs. The four possessed workers knelt in their circle, chanting in that inhuman language while Victor took his place behind the altar. But this time, their ritual felt smaller, more desperate. You cannot stop what has already begun, Victor declared, raising the writhing, dark object above his head. We have claimed this territory. We have marked this family. You've claimed nothing, Carlos said, stepping into the circle. The moment his feet crossed the threshold, everything changed. The candles flared brighter, but their light was no longer the sickly yellow that had illuminated Carlos's previous visit. Now they burned with clear, white light that made the painted symbols on the walls look like nothing more than smudged charcoal. Victor shrieked, not a human sound, but something like steam escaping from a broken pipe. What have you done? Carlos looked down at the shirt. It was glowing softly, not with any external light, but as if it were woven from captured sunlight. The warmth spread through his chest and arms, filling him with strength he'd never known he possessed. I remembered who I am, Carlos said simply. The four kneeling figures turned toward him, their black eyes reflecting the new light. For the first time since Carlos had started working at the house, he saw recognition in their faces. Not the hollow obedience of the possessed, but human confusion and fear. Help us, one of them whispered. Patricia, the woman who had told him that time moved differently here. Please help us. Victor raised the dark object higher, and Carlos could see it was trying to drain the new light from the room, to pull the hope out of the air itself. But the shirt's warmth was growing stronger, spreading beyond Carlos, to touch the four people who had been trapped here. This ends now, Carlos said, and stepped toward the altar. Victor began to change, his human disguise melting away like wax. His skin became gray and scaled. His eyes turned the color of dried blood, and his fingers stretched into claws. The thing he held pulsed with malevolent energy, but it was fighting against something stronger. Carlos reached for the dark object, and Victor slashed at him with those terrible claws. But they passed through the white light surrounding Carlos without making contact. And when Carlos's hands closed around the writhing thing, it began to dissolve. You cannot, Victor screamed. We had a contract. Contracts signed under false pretenses aren't valid in any court, Carlos replied. And he wasn't sure if the knowledge came from his own experience or from something older and wiser speaking through him. The dark object crumbled to ash in Carlos's hands, and Victor's scream rose to a pitch that shattered every piece of glass in the basement. The painted symbols on the walls began to smoke and peel, revealing clean concrete underneath. Victor and the shadows around him fled upward, not through the stairs, but through the walls themselves, leaving behind only the smell of sulfur and defeat. Carlos turned to the four workers who were slowly standing and looking around as if seeing the basement for the first time. How long have we been here? Patricia asked. What year is it? Asked one of the men. Carlos helped them up the stairs and out of the house. Outside, they scattered in different directions, each eager to return to families and lives they'd forgotten they had. Carlos was the last to leave. As he closed the front door behind him, he looked back to see that the house was already changing. The dark windows were letting in moonlight, the sagging front steps had straightened, and even the brick seemed cleaner. Carlos walked slowly through the empty streets, processing everything that had happened. The shirt no longer glowed, but it still felt warm against his skin, and he still felt that unusual strength and certainty. When he reached the streetlight where he'd first met the mysterious stranger, Carlos wasn't surprised to find a small piece of paper tucked under the lamppost. The note was written in elegant handwriting. "The shirt belongs to whoever needs it most. When your trials are over, you will know who that is. Trust in yourself, trust in love, and remember that light always conquers darkness. A friend." Carlos read the note twice, then looked around hoping to see the man in the fedora and overcoat. But the street was empty. When he looked back at the paper, the words were fading. Within seconds, the note was blank, and moments after that, it crumbled to dust in his hands. Carlos smiled. He understood now. The stranger hadn't been just a man. He was something more, something that appeared when good people faced impossible odds and needed to remember their own strength. 3 weeks later, Carlos was hired at an auto repair shop owned by a kind man who was impressed with Carlos's experience and didn't mind his still developing English. The pay wasn't as much as Victor had offered, but it was honest work that let him sleep peacefully at night. Sofia had made her first real friend at school, a girl who helped her with English in exchange for help with math. Miguel was playing soccer with neighborhood kids and coming home dirty and happy every afternoon. Anna still worked long hours, but now she came home to a husband who met her at the door with a smile instead of worry lines and desperation. "You're different," she told him one evening, as they watched the children do homework at the kitchen table. "More confident, peaceful." Carlos looked down at the white shirt he wore under his work clothes every day. "I learned something important recently." "What's that?" "That being a good father isn't about having all the answers or being able to solve every problem," Carlos said. "It's about being willing to fight for what matters, even when you're scared." Anna kissed his cheek. "I always knew that about you." That night, after the children were asleep, Carlos carefully folded the white shirt and placed it in their closet. He had a feeling that someday, when another desperate father needed to remember his own strength, he would know exactly who should have it. Outside their apartment window, a figure in a dark overcoat and wide-brimmed fedora walked past under the streetlights, nodding once in satisfaction, before disappearing into the shadows between buildings. Some battles end, but the war between light and darkness continues. And sometimes, the most unlikely warriors are parents who refuse to let evil touch their families, armed with nothing more than love, faith, and a reminder that they're stronger than they know.